last years of the 19th century, that human affairs were being watched from the timeless worlds of space. No one could have dreamed we were being scrutinized as someone with a microscope studies creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. Few men even considered the possibility of life on other planets. And yet, across the gulf of space, minds immeasurably superior to ours regarded this Earth with envious eyes. And slowly and surely, they drew their plans against us.
Broadcasting live
from a tiny studio somewhere in North America.
This is Dark Matters Radio Live. And now I give you your host,
the silverback of ufology.
Here's Don Ecker.
And greetings, ladies, gentlemen, and everybody in between. Welcome back to another brand new show, Dark Matters Radio. Tonight, our very special guest, Dr. Kevin Randle, a guy I've known for a very long time, and over the years have interviewed him many times. He never disappoints. And of course, Gerry Kissell will be joining us, is here. And tonight, because of some other things that popped up, Mark Center may or may not be able to join the program in progress. So we're gonna see how it goes. Now, got a lot going on. Of course, the disclosure business is always on the front burner. Tomorrow night, our president's going to be addressing the joint session of Congress. It's unlikely he's going to broach that topic, but with this guy, who knows? And let's see, what else is going on? We've got some rather coolish weather out here in sunny Southern California, and it's a beautiful day outside, very clear, very bright, but a little coolish. I'm waiting for those 80-degree days, gang. I got to tell you, I got to be honest. But with that said, Gerry, how the heck are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Just saw that our friend Mark D'Antonio is in the audience. And said
yes, he is.
Kevin Randle.
Yes, he is. Oh, and our buddy Andrew over from the UK is here too. All right, with that being said, and Anima is here.
Love of my life. Hi, baby.
With that being said, let us bring our guest on, Dr. Kevin Randle, a.k.a. Lieutenant Colonel, retired Randle, and all around, sometimes a pain in the ass kind of guy, but a good guy. Kevin, how the hell are you?
Well, I'm working on my pain in the ass persona tonight, so.
Okay. All right. Well, hey, I do that. Okay. I do that. All
Good
right.
evening, Dr. Lieutenant Colonel.
Thank you so much.
This was PFC Kissell, by the way.
Yeah.
He kept getting busted.
I was going to say, he raise all the way to PFC. What an extraordinary military career.
Yes,
I like
sir.
things at an even line.
Hey, Kevin, let me ask you. Now, you have been doing this business going back to the 70s. Probably had an interest in it before that. I did. And I got to say that I was convinced right up until 2017, December actually, when everything seemed to go in the UFO field, which, by the way, our friends in the government thoughtfully provided a new name for it, UAP. I still call it UFO UAP. But Until that time, I was convinced we would get no further than we did all the way back then. Do you see any type of a change? I know you're very skeptical about a lot of this stuff, but where do you come down on it?
I kind of follow your path, which was when I got into it, and actually it was my interest kind of developed in the 1960s when I was in high school, which I hesitate to say, which means that I'm older than heck. I thought the disclosure was kind of the myth. It's not going to happen. The government's never going to admit what they've been doing for all these years. And then, of course, as you say, we had 2017 with the release of the Navy videos, cockpit videos. And I thought, well, now we're taking a step forward. But here we are 8 years later, and we are actually no closer than we were in 2017. We don't know anything more. We've got the government inventing all kinds of new projects to investigate UFOs. And we've heard many, many stories about what they're doing to investigate UFOs and setting up the logistics and who's going to be doing it and how many offices are going to be run and where the information is going to go. But we get very little information about it other than, well, it's an awful lot of mundane stuff going on out there, which had they asked me and probably asked you, Don, and maybe even you, Gerry, I'm sorry, that
it's Gerry.
We know that 95%, 99% of the UFO sightings are mundane objects. We know that. We know that people are not as well versed of what's in the sky as they could be, although we see that increasing. People are becoming more aware of what's going on around them and in the sky. But an awful lot of people see things under unusual circumstances and report them as UAP that don't really fit the criterion of being a UAP. So we all know that. And when the government comes out and says, we're investigating this, but we're finding all these answers for these objects that are being cited, we already know that. We don't care about those. We're interested in the cases in which there is no good, solid, mundane explanation. And if you wanted to say which case fits that probably the best, I, of course, would suggest Roswell as a very strong case, but I would also say Level Land, Texas, where you had the craft interacting with the environment. You had what the sheriff said were literally hundreds of people calling his office about this UFO. It was stalling cars. The law enforcement was involved and had their cars stalled. And even the Air Force was out there that night in November of 1957 looking for the UFO, following the sheriff around, and their cars were stalled. So we've got a litany of very good cases that should be looked at. And I don't see us having moved any closer to disclosure now, even though it looked in 2017 as we were taking steps forward. I don't think we're getting anywhere near it.
Well, I got to tell you, I agree with that wholeheartedly. But that wasn't the only case that affected the environment. Bob Solis, who had been an Air Force nuclear missile officer, has come forward over the years talking about an incident that happened in 1967 that had to be totally shocking to the military establishment, not to mention our own civilian government at that time. A UFO made an incursion into a nuclear facility where Minuteman missiles with nuclear warheads were positioned in the event of an attack. They were to be our retaliatory arm, and basically this bogey, whatever it was able to knock the entire flight of Minuteman missiles right out of the ball game. As a matter of fact, later it came out that a couple of those missiles had been pulled to check their components and what have you. One had to be totally replaced. Now, with something like that, when these congressional hearings finally began a couple of years back, don't you think Salas should have been one of the first people to be interviewed by Congress?
I think they've looked at an awful lot of that stuff. You've referring to, of course, the Belt Montana sightings, which were investigated by the Air Force, but they investigated the sightings by civilians and didn't really look at the Minuteman problem. But and originally, this would have been a matter of national security, because you don't want the enemy, whomever that might be, to know that you can disable our retaliatory capability from the outside. Allegedly, it can't be done. There would be nothing that would shut down an entire flight of missiles. And yet that's exactly what happened. And when the Condon Committee, which was the Air Force sponsored investigation of UFOs back in the late 1960s, their representative went to Malmstrom Air Force Base to talk about that. The officer involved in that was surprised that he knew about the sightings, but said, I can't go into that. It's national security. And it would be national security. The Air Force investigation suggested there was some kind of malfunction internally that took the flight down, which doesn't make any sense. And you had a series of very good sightings at the same time reported, civilians involved in the sightings in and around, I think it's Great Falls, Montana, that area, that suggested something was going on. So it's a very interesting sighting, but the official conclusion, as I think you know, is that it was some kind of a glitch in the system, which was repaired, and there was no UFO involved in it. Right. I don't believe that explanation, given all the other information that has surfaced about that. But it is a very interesting sighting. Robert Hastings did a book called UFOs and Nukes, or Nukes and UFOs, where he explored an awful lot of that. I've talked to some of the missileers as well myself, especially around Francis C. Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne, Wyoming, who had similar problems with some of the equipment that they were working with. So it's a thing that has gone on, or an event that has gone on. It's not just not isolated to that one incident. There's an awful lot of incidents. And I think Robert Hastings has done a very good job of outlining all of that information. And I think people like that should be investigated, or not investigated, but should be called in front of the committees that are investigating these sorts of things. Well,
I got a question that's going to veer off the topic just a smidgen, but I've often thought about that. Now, these objects have shown, if they desire, they can shut down automobiles. My God, they can shut down military aircraft. They proved that in Tehran in 1975 with an Iranian pilot. This was before the Shia Muslims took over, but under the Shah, where some UFOs were above Tehran. They sent up a couple of F-4 Phantom jets, very tough aircraft. I had experience with Phantoms in Vietnam, as I'm sure you did too. They are a tough bird, but these things were able to shut it off, not to mention a flight of missiles. Now, I've thought about that. Kevin, do you think this could be a type of modified EMP pulse that these objects are utilizing? Or have you thought about what technology would be able to do that?
Well, what you have to look at is the capability of the UFOs to selectively deactivate some systems, which is what happens in the Tehran incident. It doesn't knock the engines out, but it knocks some of the equipment out. Right. With the Levelon case, I think it was a closed approach of the UFO. It wasn't that the craft were attempting to stall the cars. It was something in their propulsion system that didn't want the cars got too close. And there's literally dozens of reports from Levelland of that happening, but I don't think it was anything that was directed to shut them down. when you look at Tehran, then it looks like they were using some kind of a system to deactivate specific parts of the airplane's defensive systems, the aircraft's defensive systems, which is extraordinary as well. Len Stringfield, who was one of the great researchers in UFOs, talked about when he was heading toward Japan right after the end of the Second World War, as some of the first people going into Japan, that as they took off from Iwo Jima, there were I guess it was 3 craft came close to the airplane, and the engines began to sputter and having troubles. And the pilots said, well, we may have to ditch, be prepared for that. And as the craft moved away, then the engines began to function normally. So there it seems it would be kind of an accidental problem created by close approach of the UFO, as it would be in a level land. But when you move to Tehran, it looks like it's a specific type of energy that they're using to disable the aircraft's ability to intercept them.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly something. And you mentioning, you mentioning their ability to manipulate systems after the fall of the Iron Curtain, okay, journalist and UFO investigator George Knapp traveled over to the former Soviet Union. Some of the UFO investigators that he met over there had previously been fairly high scientific personnel in the Soviet scientific establishment. And he met some military officers, and one informed him of an incident that happened, and I don't recall where in the USSR it happened, but where there was a nuclear missile battery, okay, that they had out. This was circa 1983, if my memory serves. And according to Knapp, this former Soviet officer told him that there was a UFO in the area. Suddenly their battery illuminated. In other words, something turned it on, and it was in the midst of a countdown to release its missiles. Now, that had to be, my God, that had to be terrifying. But just in the last few seconds, it stopped what it was doing, the UFO, and it took off and everything returned to normal. I'm sure you're familiar with that case.
There's a lot of cases that sort of are like that we've learned about. And again, Robert Hastings does a wonderful job of providing us for information about that, where this outside force, whatever it is, the UFO, is able to manipulate the systems. And you wonder if they wanted to trigger some kind of an atomic war, they would be able to do that by launching a number of missiles. We launching the missiles to our adversaries there, we're launching missiles at us and create some kind of atomic war. I don't know what the purpose would be to do that, other than, see what we can do. But there's an awful lot of information like that. And I think that's something that needs to be explored as well, because we've got all these cases, literally hundreds of cases of the UFOs interacting with the environment, the electromagnetic grids. And I think you mentioned the EMP, electromagnetic pulse, some kind of ability to shut down electrical systems. I wasn't the great blackout in New York wasn't one of the things that was suggested. It was something that had been done by the close approach of a UFO.
Well, John Fuller, who wrote the book Incident at Exeter, was involved heavily into that situation. And he later came out and stated, and Kevin, I'm sure you'll recall this, back in those days, in the 60s, okay, there were a lot of reports where isolated power lines and transformers and what have you would occasionally be witnessed with a UFO apparently sucking power out of the system. I'm sure you've heard of those cases, right?
Well, absolutely. And you mentioned Exeter. That's one of those things. I know that Philip Klass made a whole theory out of that, suggesting that it wasn't a UFO, but it was a glowing plasma of some kind, and they would approach the the power lines or the power grid, and that would cause them to glow. And then you have to ask, from that theory, well, how come it doesn't happen today? How come there weren't just literally hundreds of reports like that, which kind of negates his theory? But that kind of led to Klass's idea that these ionizations of air would glow when they got close to the power grid. But yeah, the Exeter case is one of the cases that you look at where there's multiple witnesses to that activity, and we have just literally, I'll say, hundreds of cases like that where you've got multiple witnesses, you have multiple chains of evidence. The Air Force's investigations were never very good, except for a short period in the early 1950s when Ed Ruppelt was in charge of Project Blue Book. But mostly their activity was to debunk and to explain UFO sightings, regardless of what the facts were. And that's why with the Levelland case, which I keep calling back to because of all the interaction with the environment and the number of witnesses, they wrote it off as ball lightning. That's their final explanation for Levelland. And you say, okay, ball lightning, does it in fact exist? And if it does, what we know about it is it's very short-lived, and it's about 18 to 24 inches in diameter when you see it, and it's always close to the ground. The Levelland event took place over 2.5, 3 hours, and there's no evidence. There's no case where a ball lightning has stalled a car.
Right.
So the point simply is the Air Force and the government has engaged in a campaign to explain all UFO sightings, no matter how ridiculous those explanations are. And then we hear the news media jumping on board with that because they want to seem to be too sophisticated to believe in flying saucers, for crying out loud, regardless of what the evidence is. And you take a look at the way the news media treated UFOs for almost the entire history of it, and you can see where they're reporting it, but it's tongue-in-cheek and kind of, well, this is a story we have, but we're too sophisticated to believe in flying saucers. But when you get back and you look at the evidence of those cases, you find out they're much more substantial than we've been led to believe.
Well, looking back at that situation, by the way, that great New York blackout, the year was 1965. The entire city of New York was blacked out. I don't recall now how wide-ranging that blackout was, but it was pretty substantial. But a little interesting tidbit of information. Do you know what happened 9 months later, Kevin?
Yes, there was a huge spike in the births. Well,
That's correct. You win a cookie.
Is it chocolate chip?
Yeah, well, it could be.
Yes, that's kind. Yeah, people were bored. What are we going to do? Well, I guess we'll have some fun in the bedroom.
Yeah, 9 months later, a birth explosion. Well, look, I was convinced when my wife and I were publishing UFO magazine. And by that time, I had broken on national TV, of course, in the magazine and in news reports, a couple of really big stories. And we had butted heads with people at the Pentagon. We had butted heads with NASA. We had I personally butted heads with practically every skeptic of known or even ill repute in this country. Phil Klass, of course, was one of at that time, the biggest ones.
Well, let me interrupt Don for just a second and point out that when you're talking about people like Phil Klass, you're not talking about a skeptic, you're talking about a debunker.
Exactly.
A skeptic will look at the evidence and decide for him or herself where the truth lies. They will not go into the investigation and say there are no UFOs, there's no alien visitation, ergo anything that suggests that must be a hoax or a lie. Sorry to interrupt you
No, that's fine.
I wanted to make that distinction.
But I got into it. I'm one of those guys that I'm not afraid of the controversy. I had invited class on my radio show several times. The last time we were on the air together on my show, this is in the early, about 94, maybe 95. We started discussing the 1952 overflights of Washington, D.C. Now, that was something, any UFO investigator worth their salt had to examine that case down to the nth degree. Everybody thinks it happened on 2 weekends. It actually happened on 3 weekends, the last couple of weeks of July and the first part of August, when these things swarmed into the Capitol. But class and I are on the air. We're talking about that. And suddenly I must have said something that animated him. And he said, "Oh, now, wait a minute. If anybody in the military thought that these were actually extraterrestrial," I forget what word he used, craft, they didn't know if there was going to be an invasion or, my God, they would have had every jet in the sky. But it took them 2 hours or something like that, an hour and a half, 2 hours, to get a jet in from, the place that Biden is from, Delaware. And I said, "Well, Phil, no, wait a minute." I said, "I checked this. And if you recall, the Air Force public spokesperson for the civilian press was a guy by the name of Al Chop. I tracked down Al Chop's number. I called him, and this is what he told me. All the bases in the Washington, D.C. area were undergoing resurfacing and repairs." When I said that, class exploded. "Bullshit! That's bullshit! That's pure bullshit!" And I said, "Phil, you're on my radio show. What are you doing cussing?" And he said, "Fine, good night." And he hung up. That was the last time I ever heard from that guy.
Well, let me, you were correct. Anybody who's been in the UFO field very long has investigated the case. I talked to Al Chop and to Dewey Fournay, and they were in the radar room the second night of the sightings there over Washington, D.C. And I forget which one of them told me, well, there was one sighting that got pretty hairy. They brought in the jet fighters, and one of them got surrounded by these UFOs, these glowing orbs. But he wouldn't tell me much about it. He said, I don't want to talk about it. It's classified. So I called the other guy, and I don't know whether I called Dewey Fournay first or Al Chop first, but I said the other one. He said that there was this really gory sighting, and he told me all about it. So I got the information. But what came out of that, which I think is important, was the Air Force explanation for the sightings was a temperature inversion, which is a layer of warm air over a layer of cold air. So you get a refraction of the atmosphere. So the things that you're looking at in the sky aren't where they are. It's like,
yeah, but radar operators know the difference.
Excuse me, I will get to that in just a moment. But you put a pencil in a vest of water and you know how it looks bent. Well, both Chop and Fournay told me, we saw the images on the radar scope and they weren't weather related. So I've talked to two of the guys who were in the radar room talking to the radar operator. Ben Barnes, I think, was one of them, saying they know what.
Didn't he go outside and look?
A number of them did go outside and look and see the objects as well. But I think the point really is, these were the experts. They're in Washington, D.C. These guys are the best radar men that you could possibly have there. And they're not going to be fooled by some phantom blip on the radar based on a temperature inversion refracting the atmosphere. Not to mention, one of them, and I forget to, I'd have to go back. Well, actually, I did a book called The Washington Nationals, which, by the way, I'm going to digress for just a moment. It created the greatest headline I ever saw in a newspaper. It's the Cedar Rapids Gazette for the at the end of July of 1952. And the banner headline says, "Saucers swarm over Capitol." I'm thinking this is right out of a science fiction movie, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
But the point is, the people I talked to who were there, the radar operators were there, the airline pilots who saw these things, the fighter pilots who saw these things, and Chop or Fournet, I forget which one, told me that when the UFO, when the fighters began to enter the airspace, the UFOs disappeared, and when they left the airspace, the UFOs came back. How do you explain that as a temperature inversion? One of the guys, I think his name was Patterson, was actually surrounded at one point by the lights. They were miles away from him, but he was kind of surrounded by these things. And he mentioned that his onboard radar picked them up. This is not a temperature inversion. This is something more extraordinary than that. But
they were used to those up there around DC too. And they knew very well what one looked like and what it didn't look like.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about that. You're absolutely right there, Gerry. But I said, I did a book on the Washington Nationals, and the transcripts of my interviews with the people who were involved there, other pilots who were involved in this thing, the newspaper clippings, and everything else that was going on in July of 1952. There was an awful lot of sightings all over the country. We focus on the Washington Nationals because those were the most spectacular of the sightings, but there were similar sightings all around the country going on. And I don't know how many Air Force pilots were involved in chasing these things at that time. That gave rise to the Robertson panel, which was CIA sponsored. And I think Michael Swords and Robert, I'm sorry, I can't remember your last name at the moment, did an analysis of all of that sort of thing in a book called UFOs and Government, or Government and UFOs, which provides us with additional information about the Robertson panel, which suggests here was a series of meetings that took place over 5 days in Washington, D.C. Some very smart scientists involved, all of them chosen because they were pretty much rabidly anti-saucer, and they concluded there was not enough evidence to lead us to the extraterrestrial flying saucers. But Swords, Robert Powell, sorry, Robert, I couldn't remember your name at first. Mike Swords and Robert Powell explored this. And what they found was that Robertson, on the final day, the meeting ended late on a Friday afternoon. The next day, he's got the report completed. And two of the guys have already signed off on it. And you have to say, how did he do that overnight? And the answer is because he didn't. The report was written before the first witness was interviewed. The first bit of evidence was examined. They know exactly where they were going to go. They know exactly what they're going to do. And they picked people who were rabidly anti-saucer, who would conform to the opinion there's nothing to this. So we're getting back to the long history of ufology, where the government has manipulated the system enough to convince an awful lot of people there's nothing to it.
Well, now, several years back, there was a 2-season television program on the History Channel called Unidentified. And in that, in that program, we were introduced to a number of individuals. 4 of the 5 were very highly placed, supposedly. Christopher Mellon, an undersecretary of defense dealing with military intelligence. Hal Puthoff, formerly, or for all I know, still involved with the Central Intelligence Agency. I believe his first name is Steve Justice, from the Lockheed Skunk Works, okay? And of course, our buddy Lou Elizondo, who allegedly, and there's still a lot of discussion about this, him heading up the ATIP program, which was created by his buddy, the senator from Nevada. You all know who I'm talking about.
Harry Reid.
And of course,
Harry Reid.
Yeah. I don't like to say his name.
I'm sorry. I thought maybe you were having one of those senior moments that I had.
Senior moments.
A moment ago when I couldn't remember Powell's last name. I was trying to help you out. You just made it worse.
It's the Voldemort of Don Ecker's Harry Potter world. the name that shall not be said.
Yes, there we go.
So, and of course, Tom DeLonge from Blink 182. Now, how the hell a rock and roller got into that crowd, I don't know. But I watched every episode of that show when it was on the air. And I noticed something very interesting, at least as far as I was concerned. Every program, and they played it for the most part pretty damn straight, you know, these cases and situations and what happened. But you had that ominous drumbeat toward the end of the show, and they always managed to say, or this could be a potential threat. Now, well, that of course is true enough, but these guys today can be seen everywhere. Put off people like Kit Green, another CIA PhD. Well, there's a whole litany of these guys, and Christopher Melton. Now, I got to say, back in the 90s, Kevin, and I'm sure you're probably of the same mind, if not, by all means, correct me, but I never thought we would get somebody from that bit of rarefied atmosphere into the public mix. Now, with that being said, and I'm using my cop background, my cop thinking, that told me one of a couple of possibilities. Number one, this was the biggest dog and pony show the Pentagon ever put on. Number two, well, with people like Putoff, Mellon, and others involved in this, not to mention Justice from Lockheed, maybe they know something, and this was a way of softly preparing the public for something coming down the road. Or there's another possibility. Somebody with the budget and the TV show decided, hey, everybody's interested in UFOs. I'll bet we can make a bundle of money. Where do you come down on any of that, Kevin?
Part C. If you remember, in the late 1990s, we were on a show called SF Vortex.
Yeah.
And those of us who were not from the LA area were put up in a hotel. And they sent a car for us, and we're riding there. There were three of us in the car. Me, Carl Flock, and Russ Estes. And I looked at those guys and I realized, all three of us have connections to the intelligence community. Flock said that he was some kind of a case officer with the CIA at one point. Russ Estes was involved with the Army Security Agency, and I had been in Air Force intelligence.
Right.
And I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. All three of us had this intelligence background, and we're going in to debate UFOs. You were there, and Dwight
Schultz,
thank you, was there. But I think there was somebody else there too. But I thought that was kind of interesting that we were all had links into the intelligence community, so you could draw your conclusion from that as well. I know, based on my own experience, because of my interest in UFOs and the fact I was in the intelligence community, I received some information from various Air Force personnel, later Army personnel as well, because I was an Army intelligence officer at the end of my career, about UFOs, because they knew I would be interested in it and that I wouldn't scoff at their stories. But it was always, well, don't say anything to anybody about this, but. And I chased down one story where the guy supposedly had flown President Kennedy to see the bodies from Roswell. I finally found the guy who's a retired colonel. He'd flown Air Force One with John Kennedy on it. I finally chased the guy down, and it turned out, well, yes, he had been an alternate pilot on Air Force One. Yes, he had flown John Kennedy around. And yes, he had seen a UFO off the wing of his aircraft, not Air Force One, but another aircraft, with a dome disc on it. And you could see the being on the inside of the craft. All the elements were there, but it wasn't John Kennedy going to see the Roswell bodies. It was he flying John Kennedy around, and he had a UFO sighting. And I think that he was a little bit more open with me because of my military background and the fact I'd been in Air Force intelligence at one point. But that's the kind of thing we run into, that you've got people with interesting credentials who talk about these things. But the people you mentioned have been around since the late 1990s talking about this stuff, and we're no further down the road than we were when they came out.
Unfortunately, you're absolutely correct. Well, Kevin, let me ask you this. You've been at this even longer than I have. And during all that time that I was with the magazine, Vicki and I were doing the magazine, I couldn't tell you how many, and we talked, my God, we talked literally over the years. We were doing it over 20 years. We talked to thousands of people, some connected, some might have been connected, a lot of interested parties. But I must have been told, if I was told once, I was told probably 2,000 times that, yes, there are ETs here. Yes, they're not all from one group. Yes, there may be as many as 7 or 8 groups or more. And yes, several of those groups are kindly bent toward humanity. Several of them are basically indifferent. They're here for whatever reason they're here, coming, going, whatever. Maybe we're interesting to take a look at the Petri dish. But he said, or these people said, there is one group that is here that is inimical toward the human race. And that kind of surprised me. And I said, why? And this person, or a couple of people, said they didn't know. But later on, I became friends with Ingo Swann, the psychic, and he was regarded as one of probably the most talented psychics in the world during his lifetime. He was the guy that designed the programs for the remote viewing project called, well, publicly Stargate. And I had dinner out here in California, in Burbank, as a matter of fact, with Swann. And he was interested in the work that I had been conducting at that point for years on lunar moon phenomenon. And I was fascinated when I got a copy of his book, Penetration, and read it, and then read it again, then read it again. Now, in that book, he talks about how he was recruited. He ended up going to Stanford Research. At the time, they were not aware that this was basically being funded by the CIA. There was, much like back in the 50s, there was a fear of a Soviet-Russian missile gap. They were sending satellites into orbit, And we were lucky if our rockets didn't blow up on the pad. So that really kicked first Eisenhower and then President Kennedy in the tail end to get our space program going. Well, in the mid to latter 60s, the next big thing was the psychic gap. It came to light that the Soviet Union was pouring, my God, millions of rubles, which was their type of currency, into psychic research. So we couldn't fall behind. We had to do that. Well, apparently we had a couple of extraordinarily gifted psychics. One was Swan. The other was a guy by the name of Pat Price. Now, Price is an interesting story in itself, but I'm not going to go into that here.
Don, I have to interrupt you right here, and it's a critical point. I did a investigation of an abduction in Utah back in 1976. When I wrote the story for the magazine, I made up a name for the woman because she didn't want to be identified, and I called her Pat Price. I just wanted to make sure that Pat Price is not what you're talking about. I don't want anybody to make that connection.
No,
Pat
no.
Price, the woman I'm talking about, her name was Pat Roach. That was her real name. I made it Pat Price. It's not the same person that you're talking about. So
no,
please don't make that connection.
My Pat Price was a male. And I will say this. This came out later. He died. Price died under very mysterious circumstances. There are those who believe today that he was basically assassinated by the Soviet Union. Now, I have no way of knowing one way or the other, but he was definitely seen as a threat. As a matter of fact, he and Swan, when they were being tested with their talent, inadvertently, this is actually kind of funny in light of recent news stories, inadvertently discovered an NSA, that's a National Security Agency, black site, in West Virginia. And Price, during his remote viewing session, even came up with code names of projects the NSA was working on. That freaked some people out. But then later, it came out that he was a double agent for the Church of Scientology. Now, in my paper that I wrote on disclosure, I noticed that there were a lot of people that at one point or another had been affiliated with Scientology. Swan had been, Pat Price had been, and it was not known at the time. And at that time, Scientology and the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, were at war with each other. And L. Ron Hubbard, the guy that created Scientology, he had by then
science fiction writer.
Yeah, I did read a couple of his books. They weren't that good.
Yeah, he had a wonderful publicity agent that cranked those things out and got him a lot of money. But no, his science fiction isn't that good.
His best sci-fi is Scientology.
Well, his wife, L. Ron Hubbard's wife, who I don't know if she's still around or not, but at that time was arrested, went to trial, was convicted, and she did some jail time. But, SRI, Stanford Research Institute, Price had been taking files and passing them, the stuff that they were doing, to his handler at Scientology. I don't know if a lot of people are aware of that or not, but it's a juicy little tidbit. But anyway, here are all these guys that are working in this. Now, Swan, within the IC, I guess I should explain that. within the intelligence community, okay, was proving to be quite a star. And as he stated in his book, and there's a reason to all this, okay? So this is not just a history thing. That he would be contacted by somebody very powerful that would want to talk to him. And Swan said, okay, fine. And about 3 or 4 weeks later, he gets a phone call around 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, he was living in New York City. And he was told to get up, get dressed, go down to a phone booth, talk to, there would be a phone call waiting for him at this phone booth. And it turned out to be this very mysterious man calling himself Axelrod. Okay. Well, the bottom line was they scooted Swan up, put a blindfold over him, took him out to an airfield, put him on a helicopter, and they started flying. And he ended up at this undisclosed, nondescript building where he was taken downstairs. These guys knew Swan, okay? Swan was a Tipperillo, little cigars, smoker. They had a whole supply of these cigars for him. And they told him they wanted to purchase his services for several days to the tune of $1,000 a day, which back in the mid-70s, that healthy chunk of change. And they had a remote viewing job. Well, he basically ended up remote viewing, according to Swan, what turned out to be the far side of the moon. And back there were, not just Swan, I mean, stuff have also crept out of NASA with some of the former astronauts. There was what appeared to be a facility back there with all kinds of things, buildings, radar, what looked like radar dishes, living habitats, etc., on the far side of the moon, the side we never see. And Swan was totally freaked out. And when I had dinner with him, I examined his face closely. And I can tell you, he was still freaked out about that. And what freaked him out the most was that the beings that were supposedly inhabiting this remote facility were ET. They were highly psychic, and they regarded psychic talent in human beings as a threat to them. Now, I thought about that a lot, and I thought, well, is this the group, okay, that people had told me about years past that is inimical toward humanity? And it very well may be, but I had to get that out there, Kevin.
I have done very little research into the Stargate program, other than the one that featured Colonel O'Neill on the Sci-Fi Channel for a decade or so. But I have not done a whole lot of research into that. So I really don't have a good background in discussing that at all. It's an interesting story, though. It's an interesting thing.
Well, for 20 years plus, the government, the military, the CIA, the DIA funded it. So, if they were funding it for over 20 years, that tells me they had to be getting some type of value out of it. Wouldn't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm also reminded that during that time frame, there was a secret astronaut program too that was run out of Vandenberg Air Force Base. I discussed it in UFOs in the Deep State. They're training people to be astronauts, not in the program that we're aware of at NASA. This is another unit that's in training astronauts. I think it's been closed down since then, and there's been some good reporting on it. But we've got all kinds of programs like that we are not told about, black programs, I should say, that keeps us in the dark about that. And sometimes it's considered a subject of national security, like the shutdown of the missiles at Malmstrom Air Force Base being national security. So we have to take a look at that. When we interviewed Sheridan Cavett in the Roswell case, Cavett being the counterintelligence officer that was involved with Jesse Marcel and the people at Roswell, we interviewed him at his winter home.
Kevin, I'm sorry to break in here, but we're right at the break point.
Okay.
Let's pick up there when we get back. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight on Dark Matters Radio, my very special guest, longtime friend, Colonel Dr. Kevin. What was your last name again? Randle. Oh yeah, Randle. Senior moment, Kevin, you know. So anyway, we'll be back with a lot more after the break. Stick around. And we are back. Of course, Dr. Kevin Randle. You were starting a story when I so rudely interrupted you. So please.
Yes, I was. And thankfully, even though at my advanced age, I can remember that far back. Just a few minutes ago. We were in Sierra Vista, Arizona, where Sheridan Cavett was wintering with his wife, Mary, which is right outside of Fort Huachuca, which, for those of us we know the Fort Huachuca is the intelligence schools for the Army and the intelligence function that the Army is there. He was there. When we left him, after discussing the Roswell case with him, where he lied to us repeatedly, he said, if you boys find anything that impacts national security, will you keep it quiet? We said yes. And he said, he was very happy about that. And I say, but he lied to us repeatedly because he told us at that time, we were talking about the Roswell case and that sort of thing. And the mogul balloon explanation was being floated around, and I used the pun purposely. And we talked to him about it. He said, now he and Bill Rickett, who was the NCOIC, with him at Roswell, were too busy doing their work to be chasing any balloons. And then, of course, we get later down the road, and he's talking to Colonel Weaver, who ran the Air Force investigation back in the mid-1990s. And there's a long interview with him. And Cavett says, yeah, he was out there with Marcel, and he did this, and he did the other thing. And that he recognized it immediately that it was weather balloon material. And then they go off on a tangent. I'm thinking, if I'm conducting this interview, my next question is going to be, did you bother to communicate this rather important piece of intelligence to Colonel Blanchard, the base commander, that it's a balloon and nothing extraordinary? That question never came up. But the point simply is Cavett is now saying that he was there. Don and I interviewed Cavett at his home in Squeam, Washington. That's where he made his home sometime later. And it was a month after, I think, Weaver had interviewed him. And I was talking to him about what he had done. And I said, well, we have this description of this guy who was a good West Texas boy and could ride horses and accompanied Marcel out to the debris field that Mac Brazel had led him to. And Cavett says, well, that sounds like me, but I wasn't there. He clearly was there. He was clearly lying to us, is I guess the whole point. But he was interested in us preserving national security, and certainly we would have done that if it had come up. But it didn't come up. And I thought that was kind of an interesting, this is sort of a sidelight to what you were talking about with Ingalls Swan and the people and the things that you had learned from them in your investigations.
Well, back in the day, and I want to give you and Don Schmidt full credit, you guys gave me the telephone number, where I was able to call General McMullen and interview him. And, just what he told me, now, granted, it was on the phone. I think, if I remember, he was living in Florida then. I think it was Florida. But we had a nice chat. And it would have been interesting to get him on the record with Cavett. Cavett would have been doing, I'm sure, twists and turns if that would have happened.
Well, I think Cavett, because he was counterintelligence, and it was not part of the Strategic Air Command. McMullen was the deputy commander of Strategic Air Command, Cavett being CIC, his chain of command ran up a different road. He was at Roswell, but he technically was not under the command of Colonel Blanchard, who was the base commander there. He was under the command of Doyle Reese, I think, who was in Albuquerque. His chain of command ran that, and I forget that it's Class 4 or something event there in Roswell, which means the base is required to provide support, but they're not part of that base's chain of command. So I think, depending on Cavett's attitude, I don't think he would have said much to McMullen, who was not properly briefed not properly briefed is not right, because McMullen would have known what was going on at that time, because the debris from Roswell would have went through Fort Worth, which was Ramey's command, which is part of the 8th Air Force, which was part of the Strategic Air Command. So it would have gone to Ramey and then to the Strategic Airman. Trying to remember the name of the man who would have been in charge of the street. Hap Arnold would have been in charge. McMullen was his deputy. So they would have known what was happening in Roswell. So if they sat down together with nobody around, they may have discussed it. If there was somebody interviewing them together at the same time, I'm thinking they would have been protecting the secret.
Well, there was a story that you told me years ago, and it involved Mac Brazel's son, Bill Brazel. After the incident that happened, and the military, the Army Air Force, it was still the Army Air Force then, went out to the crash site debris field and picked up all the material they could find. All right, take it back. I kind of doubt they would have done that, Kevin, with a weather balloon. But later, Bill Brazel, I guess he had a taste for a cold beer now and again, was in town in his favorite bar, having a cold one, and he started running his lip about, I still occasionally find stuff out there, and I've got it all in a shoebox under my bed, or words to that effect. Word got back to the military, and they went out and picked it up, didn't they?
Absolutely. Bill was always a little bit unsure of exactly the timing of the sequences. He couldn't remember. It was shortly after he got back to the ranch. He said that he read about his father in the newspaper. His father had been taken to Roswell to discuss the crash at Roswell. And he read about his father in the newspaper. And he said, well, the old man needs help. And he went down to the ranch. And his father showed up 4 or 6 days later. It's somewhere in that time frame. He's gone about a week. And
in a brand new truck, by the way.
That's the story. And he had some money to invest in a meat locker in Alamogordo or Las Cruces. Anyway, he was out on the ranch in the area where the thing had found, and he found some of this debris. And he was telling Don and me about it. He said there was a piece of it he said it was like monofilament fishing line, but he could shine a light in one end and it would come out the other end. I said, oh, you mean fiber optics? And he said, yes. He said there was a piece of brown colored material, very lightweight, very strong, had the density of balsa wood or the weight of balsa wood, but he couldn't get a shaving on it with his pocket knife. He wanted to see if there was any stratification there, this little piece of stuff. And he found this foil that when you wadded it up, it would unfold itself. And he said he had 10, 12 of those pieces that he picked up at time. And it's never clear whether it was within the months or a year or two after this, but he had mentioned that at the bar. And lo and behold, 4 guys showed up. And as he pointed, made it clear that he was going to surrender that material to them. It was kind of like he said, when I was in the Navy, we need volunteers, you, and you, that kind of thing. They weren't going to leave without it. And then he took them out and showed it where he'd follow them. They walked around. Now, according to some of the stories, in the years after that, the military showed up at that area of the ranch periodically to see if anything had popped up. So they would go out and kind of scout the area. They cleaned it up originally by taking a large number of soldiers out there, shoulder to shoulder, walking over the debris field, picking up as much of that material as they could find. So they didn't want to leave a scrap behind. guy named Tommy Tyree, as a matter of fact, who was a sometime ranch hand we built with Mac Brazel, said they were out riding horses sometime after this event. There was a sinkhole with water at the bottom. And Brazel said, with that material we talked about, where there's a piece of it floating in the water down there, they couldn't get down to it because the sinkhole was so deep, but they could see the bit of debris finding there. We did a archaeological site survey there in the early 90s, and there's since been other archaeological expeditions out there to search for debris. We were told to look for, to dig out the roots of plants that looked like they'd been there for 50 years or more, because pack rats would gather the brightly colored stuff and would take it into their burrows, and they would be found there. So we might find that stuff. But we were told, but mostly you probably ought to be looking in West Texas now, because of the winds that blow through New Mexico, and that area would have shifted all this debris to West Texas. The impact site was much closer to Roswell, but it wasn't the kind of debris field we got up on what we call the debris field. The impact site, the stuff was not that spread out. It was kind of a compact area, but that was much closer to Roswell.
So here we are now in 2025, and among the UFO faithful, all right, they are convinced that the idea of disclosure is just around the corner. And if there is anybody in a position of governmental power that could release it, the most popular choice right now is our current president. And Kevin, after what happened to him the last 8 years, from various units in the IC and the media, etc., I could almost believe that. What do you what do you think?
I've often said that if I was a president, that if I wanted to get the answer on UFOs, I'd call in my director of Central Intelligence and I say, what can you tell me about UFOs? And if he said to me, well, I can't tell you, Mr. President, you're not clear to know that, I said, you're fired, bring in your deputy. And I'd go down the chain of command in this whatever organization until I could get the information. But since I made those comments, I talked to a couple of people. One of them had interviews with Jimmy Carter, who was going to disclose everything. And Carter was the president-elect at the time, and he was talking to George H.W. Bush, who was the director of Central Intelligence. And so they were discussing about this, and the subject of UFOs came up. And Bush said, well, I would like to remain on in your administration as the director of Central Intelligence. And Carter said, no, I'm bringing in my own guy. And Bush said, well, I can't tell you about the UFOs because you're not the president yet. But I think what happens is if the president shows interest in the topic, he goes to the director of Central Intelligence and says, I want to know everything you can tell me about UFOs. I think the answer is, well, Mr. President, there's a number of organizations that are involved in this investigation, and I will put together a report from all these organizations, a comprehensive report, so you can understand exactly what is happening. And somehow that report never gets done. He doesn't refuse to do it. He just stonewalls it into the bureaucracy, knowing that if he can stall it long enough, that man is no longer going to be president and that issue is going to go away. Or oftentimes something happens. And with Jimmy Carter, what happened, of course, was the Iranian hostage crisis. So that diverted his attention to that rather than worrying about UFOs, which had been around for literally decades prior to that time. And I think we're now 85 years from the Roswell case or something like that. The Roswell case happened 85 years ago or something like that. That there is no imminent threat from that. And I think that with what is going on now, the president is involved in an awful lot of work that takes a higher priority in his mind. UFOs are important. apparently to members of the government, but it isn't at the highest priority right now. We may eventually get to that point, but I think the bureaucrats are very good at stonewalling these sorts of things. And we have to remember there is a deep state out there, contrary to what people want to believe. The president comes in and he appoints his cabinet, he appoints his advisors. And once his administration is over, those people go away and another crew comes in. So you're starting again, literally from ground zero, to get to this information. And once again, I think that other things take priority over what is happening in the world of UFOs. Because we look back and say, they've been around for a half a century or 3/4 of a century. There apparently is no imminent threat. If there had been an imminent threat, it would have already happened. If there really is alien visitation, it is pretty much benign, and we don't have to worry about it as a threat to our national security or the security of the planet. And I think that's where things come off the rail. So I think.
Well, you know what I never hear about. We always hear about the Central Intelligence Agency. We hear about the Defense Intelligence Agency. We hear about Naval intelligence. We hear about Air Force intelligence, but nobody in my memory bank has mentioned UFOs and the NSA. Now, I mentioned the NSA for a couple of reasons. Number one, we're all familiar now about the scandal currently engulfing the NSA. All right. The fetishists, the furries, the transsexuals, and all these people that have been conducting their perversion on a government server. Okay. Yeah, I said it. Perversion. Now, when I was in the Army Security Agency. You mentioned that earlier. You mentioned the ASA. And we were conducting operations. Well, the first place I went was Okinawa. And there was a site there, and as far as I know, it's still there, called Torii Station. It had another nickname, the Big Ear of Asia. Okay. As a matter of fact, Jack, what the hell was that guy's name that had a column in the I think it was the Washington Post, Anderson, Jack Anderson's merry-go-round. He even did an expose on Torii Station there, alleging that GIs working there was trading military secrets for sexual favors from local nationals and drugs. Now you got to remember, in the very late 60s, the very early 70s, okay, there was a lot of dope going on. Okay, this is when the military really started to crack down with things like urine tests and what have you, looking for evidence of illicit drug use. Now, Anderson, when he did this story, okay, things went a little wackoid. But my point is that Torii Station, the stuff we were doing was under the very direct auspices of NSA, also known as No Such Agency. When I went to Vietnam, okay, and I was up in I Corps, okay, from Phu Bai all the way up to the demilitarized zone.
You mean the ultra-militarized zone, the UMZ?
Yeah. And I'm telling you, we were doing a lot of sketchy stuff up there, but it was all not through the Department of the Army. This all went to the Army Security Agency through NSA. Now, when I heard all that, I was freaked. Okay, I could not believe that as tightly buttoned down as the NSA was, that something like this could have happened. I'm at a loss, Kevin. Do you have any coherent explanation?
I'm not at all surprised they would use their classified servers to pass this sort of communique amongst themselves, and it was a limited number of people. I look at the Project Blue Book files, for example, and there's interesting things in there. And I mention that simply because I think when the officers or the NCOs were writing the reports that went into the Project Blue Book files, their idea was nobody's ever going to see them but other Air Force officers and NCOs. It's not going to be leaked into the public arena. Well, now we have the complete set of Project Blue Book files on the internet, so you can look up anything. And you look at some of this stuff that's going on in the communications among them, and I'm absolutely convinced that they thought nobody was ever going to see that, so they were a little bit better or a little bit looser with what they were saying because of that. And I think it's the same thing. They thought, here's a server that is well hidden from anybody, and we can say these sorts of things and nobody's ever going to see it. Unfortunately, now it's all out. So it's that kind of thinking. Back in the 70s, Richard Nixon had I think it was Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, who lost his job for telling some kind of an off-color joke on Air Force One. And the reporters reported on it and everybody was outraged. And by today's standards, it was pretty mild. But the point is, I learned the lesson right there. Don't put anything in writing you don't want to come out in some kind of public arena. And apparently nobody's gotten that lesson in today's environment. It's just, they think that it's private and it's not going to come out, and yet eventually it all does. So,
well, yeah. In today's world, there's a camera across from another camera on every corner in the United States. The NSA can listen in if they want, if they have a reason to, and maybe they don't even need a reason.
No, they don't need a reason. The Patriot Act covers that.
Every phone call you make, it doesn't make a damn if it's your home phone, landline, or a cell phone, they can tap into it. And according to the powers that be, they've got all this crap stored.
Well, yes. It's amazing what is available. And they talk about the systems that can't be hacked. And I don't know how many times people have said to me, don't worry about shopping with this particular store. We have this encryption system and it's not going to be cracked. And I don't know how many times we've been alerted to a breach of their security. And now we have to have a credit monitoring system, watch our accounts to make sure nobody's draining them like that. There was, when I was in the National Guard, we all had our personal information hacked because some idiot had a computer, a laptop with all this stuff stored on it. And I cannot believe the storage capability of our devices. I've got a 1 terabyte hard drive that fits in my pocket that's got the entire Project Blue Book files on it. I mean, incredible amounts of storage. Well, this guy had an awful lot of military personnel's records on this laptop, left it in his car, and it was stolen. So all of that stuff was compromised. I mean, how dumb do you have to be to allow somebody out of a secure area with that information on his laptop? And how dumb do you have to be for you to leave it in your car so it gets stolen? But there was
it encrypted?
No, apparently not. Because we were all alerted. Well, you got to keep monitoring your credit now because this laptop was stolen and it may be that your information was available. I was in our headquarters building, and one of the first sergeants had put up a list of names of the soldiers and of their social security numbers after them. And I went in and talked to the first sergeant. I said, you might want to take that list down. He says, why? He said, you've just published everybody's social security number out there. And I went by about 20 minutes later and the list was gone. You realize that. But I mean, sometimes you don't think about that stuff and how easy it is to gather that information and that sort of thing. So yeah, I just am amazed at the amount of information that's out there and what they're searching and what they're looking for. And if you think it's not going to be found, if you do something perverted, how it's not going to be found. I mean, kids who were on social media 15 years ago and now they're adults, stupid things they said when they were 14 years old is coming back to haunt them. Because, well, at that time you weren't, nobody was really briefed on that stuff. Although I remembered Earl Butts, and so I was very careful never to put anything on social media that I would want to come back and haunt me.
Yeah. Well, it's a very, in many regards, it's a very scary world today, Kevin. Now, with that being said, when I look at the list of people currently active in today's disclosure movement, and I mentioned some of the names: Kit Green, Hal Puthoff, of course, Luis Elizondo, Christopher Mellon, these guys, they seem... David Grush. Yes, David Grush. They seem to be, to me anyway, this is kind of a soft nod to Kaiser Soze. They seem to be the usual suspects. Do you think that there is a reason behind that, or is it just by happenstance?
I think it's mostly happenstance. I mean, it was kind of like when Carl Flock, Russ Estes, and I were in the car going to this SF Vortex to talk about it. Here's three guys with intelligence backgrounds riding in the same car going to talk about UFOs. I think it's kind of happenstance. And I think some of the people, and I'm not pointing to those people specifically, but I think some people come out with the idea that if I come up with a wild enough story in the UFO field, I'll end up being invited to symposium, and I will be receiving fees for this, and I can write books, and I can be on television talking about my experiences with the UFOs, and they're clearly making the stuff up. So I think there's some of that going on as well. But I also think there's people who are, and I don't know whether it's actually directed by somebody trying to hide stuff. I've always said if it was my job to inhibit investigation in UFOs, I would just sit back and take credit for every dumb thing that comes out. I mean, we have the MJ-12 nonsense come out. I would have told my boss, yeah, I got that organized here to kind of divert attention away from where we wanted, where they were going with this, and now they're all chasing MJ-12. We've got that kind of thing going on. We've got people claiming that, well, I was abducted when I was a teenager. I was gone for 15 minutes, but really I was fighting this war on Mars for 20 years. And once I served my 20 years, I was put back in my bed, and it was like I was only gone for 15 minutes. And people are believing that stuff. I got into an argument with somebody who told me that soldiers were not being sent to Iraq. We were being sent to Mars. And I said, well, it's an incredible piece of engineering to do that. We could order stuff from Walmart and get it within 10 days, and the travel time between Mars and Earth has got to be more than that. And we could call home and have conversations with our families. There was no delay, but depending on where Mars was, it's like a 30-minute delay between I say, hi, how's it going? And the response is, oh, it's going fine. There's no 30-minute delay. It's an instantaneous conversation like you and I are having. And people are buying this nonsense.
Look, as you know, if you will admit it, I was always nuts and bolts. Very nuts and bolts, zeroed in on this phenomenon. And after my presentation, and it was an alternate presentation at MUFON, the MUFON Symposium in 1989, I had been threatened by then director Walt Andrus that if I gave that talk, I'd never be invited to another MUFON event. And he was as good as his word. Except for two occasions.
My response to him would have been, adios, muchacho.
No, I wasn't gonna. This was in the front desk of a hotel in Vegas. I wasn't gonna get into a shouting match with him. And the guy had a chip on his shoulder as big as he was, and he was a little guy. But
I was going to say it wasn't a very big chip then.
Yeah. But anyway, except for two occasions, I was invited to LA MUFON to talk about my moon research. Now, with that being said, okay, I had one of the guys that did the videography of my presentation say, well, he said, because this friend of mine said, well, Don has such a knowledge of the history of the UFO thing. How come you guys never invite him back? You know what the guy told him? Well, the audience likes to hear stories. They like to hear stories. They don't want to hear the whole cold hard facts, okay? They want to be entertained. And there it is, Kevin, in a nutshell.
Well, I knew that because when the MUFON director who was arrested.
Jan Harzen?
Thank you, yes.
Senior moment?
Yeah. Well, I usually call that a Biden moment, but that's a whole other argument. Jen, when they invited a whole bunch of these weird people to the MUFON symposium, I called him on that and asked him about it. And he told me
Andrew Basagio and Corey Good, yes.
Yeah, he wanted, because they would put butts in the seat. He wasn't interested in whether the stories were true or not. He just was interested in filling the auditorium. And I'm thinking, MUFON's supposed to be this scientific organization. They should be exposing these people rather than providing them with a platform to spread their nonsense. And to take it another step further, you remember Gerald Anderson, who came out and talked about how as a young boy, he was on the plains of San Augustine and saw the crash saucer and all this sort of thing. And MUFON was supporting him. Don Schmidt and I didn't believe the story at all. And we were at this MUFON symposium, and it had to be in the mid 1990s. And Andrus was arguing with me about Anderson. And I said, well, we've got the evidence. The guy's not telling the truth. And he said, well, we know the truth, and it's not what you're saying. The truth will out. Of the people who criticized me for exposing Anderson, only one, Antonio Huneeus, apologized, said that he was misled. None of the other people who were supporting him ever apologized for us endorsing Anderson when we gave them the information and proved that the guy was not telling the truth.
I had a taste of that from MUFON. In October 1989, I was invited to appear on Larry King Live to talk about the Voronezh case, the UFO that landed in the then still Soviet Union in the city of Voronezh. And I went down there. King was not there. Pat Buchanan was filling in for King that night.
Oh my God.
Okay. So they had a guy, they always had to have a counterpoint. And they had this young guy from some DC defense publication on there. And the guy, hey, Kevin, the guy was a pork chop. Okay. He was just a pork chop. And so we're talking about this case. And at the very end of that program, I mentioned that, look, because these guys obviously wasn't buying my shtick. And I said, do you know that in May of 1962, at his last public presentation, General Douglas MacArthur addressed the graduating class at West Point, okay, duty, honor, country, his duty, honor, country speech. He addressed them, and toward the end of his speech, he warned the cadet class that, and I'm paraphrasing now, but basically, be ready, because we live in a miraculous age where we have all these scientific gadgets and everything. And then he said words to the effect of, and the evil cosmic powers, basically from outer space, that may someday come here. And he didn't put it like this, but he meant we might have to fight. Well, I mentioned that to Buchanan, and he had been pretty even keeled the whole time until I said that. And he exploded. He said, wait a minute. I have his speech on my wall at home. And I said, well, I've got it right here, because I had gotten a copy from West Point. I said, I've got it right here. I can read it to you. No, we're out of time. We'll have you come back, which was horse shit. Okay. Not with Buchanan, but look, he said it. So my point, the guy that was then the editor of the MUFON Journal, Dennis Stacy, castigated me in the next publication of the MUFON Journal. He said, and this I remember exactly, I could see UFO research going down the drain when Eckers said that. Well, unfortunately for Stacy, okay, he suddenly got snowed under by people all across MUFON sending him copies of Douglas MacArthur's speech. Now, Stacy never did a mea culpa, or I'm sorry, Ecker, you were correct, or I'm sorry, I spoke out of turn. Nothing. Okay. So yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Well, I have to say that a lot of the people in MUFON, I'm thinking of people like Rob Swatek, for example, are very, very dedicated and very, very honest. MUFON LA, I think, is an organization that doesn't really take its marching orders from the main organization. And there's many, many people who've helped me out in my research who are members of the MUFON organization. So, I mean, there's good people in there. I think
sure.
The problem we ran into with people like Walt Andrus, who ran
was another pork chop.
Absolutely. I looked at all of those sorts of things. Dennis Stacy, I have to say, was always very good to Don and me on our research into Roswell, so that when Philip Klass would make some comment, or they would have an article from Bill Moore and Jamie Shandera about our research, he would provide us with an opportunity to respond to it. And when the Gerald Anderson thing collapsed, which was kind of funny, they put a statement in the MUFON Journal. It was written by probably Don Berliner, but it was signed by Berliner and Stan Friedman, about how they had no confidence in most of what he said, but there was still some good information. Or it didn't mean is you couldn't believe everything that you could not disbelieve everything that Anderson said. And Dennis Stacy put an editorial comment, well, it kind of leads us to that direction, that he's no longer a credible witness. So I think that Stacy had always done right by Don and me of providing us with an opportunity to not only publish our information to the audience at MUFON, but also to respond to some of the allegations that have been slung at us unfairly. Stan Friedman, for example, wrote to our publisher and said that he was worried that Don and I were going to take other researchers' information and use it, publish it as our own without credit or attribution. And then it turns out in his book, Crash at Corona, that's exactly what he'd done to us. We had this long interview that we had done with Bill Brazel, and he quotes from it in his book, but he doesn't give us credit or attribution for it. And there was a number of places where he had done that, written around the problem of having to give us credit. Although there was one or two places where he did acknowledge our work, but for the most part, it went unacknowledged. So I'm familiar with all that kind of.
See, I couldn't do that, Kevin. It's not in me to steal somebody else's research. Without attribution.
Yes, I've always attempted to attribute the information to the original source, which led me to what I call chasing footnotes. And you read a book and there's a footnote, and I got the information from here. So you go to that footnote to get the original story. And you sometimes find out the original story is nothing like what has been published. It's been sort of massaged by the bias of the various writers as time goes on. But I try to chase it to the end. Richard Dolan, in one of his books, used some of the information that he had taken from Stan Friedman's book and credited Stan Friedman, but it wasn't Friedman's original research. It was ours that Stan had published, and Richard Dolan just used. He said, "Well, Stan Friedman wrote blah blah blah," and it turned out that it came from Don and me. So. It's a lot of, but I'm like you. I want to make sure that I give proper credit and attribution to everybody who has contributed to the work I do, rather than try to mask it. And if it's an opinion contrary to where I stand, I'm still going to publish the information and suggest, here's the other side of the coin. Funny story. I have often said my favorite explanation for the Roswell crash was they did it on purpose, because the easiest non-threatening way to introduce themselves to another civilization is to crash the flying saucer, and there's the dead crew. So they're vulnerable in that respect. And I always kind of like that as a good science fiction idea. And I think Tim Printy published that Kevin Randle believes and I wrote to him and said, no, it's my favorite one, but I don't believe it. It's just a neat science fiction. And Printy actually did an update on it that I did not.
You'd have to have a dedicated crew to go through with that, Kevin.
Well, no, you're flying the distances. Somebody croaks on the way, and it's kind of like the old submariners trick when they're being depth charged and they've got some dead guys on there. They push them out the torpedo tube, so they think they destroyed the submarine. As the bodies float to the surface. So the same kind of thing. I always thought it was kind of an interesting way of introducing yourself to a civilization by proving that you're non-threatening and you're vulnerable to some things. But I never accepted that as really the explanation of why the thing crashed. I always said it's somebody pushed the wrong button. There's always somebody who pushes the wrong button.
Let's leave UFOs for a little bit. Let me shine a little light on you. Last time we talked a few days ago, you told me you have been writing a lot of, is it fiction, military fiction?
Both science fiction and action adventure stories, which is military fiction. Yes.
You want to tell us a little bit about it?
Absolutely.
That was your cue, Kevin.
Well, I thought you might have a specific question. I did a series back in the 1980s called Vietnam Ground Zero. And I think that we did 28 books. I got an email from a publisher in England, and they wanted to know if those books were available. I got the rights back to them and sold them to this publisher in England. The books have been doing very well. And since that time, I've written 3 additional of these action adventure books. I did a book, another action adventure type book, that when I finished it, I said, I know what the next one could be. And I asked them if they'd like to publish it. And they said, yes, they would. A number of the other action adventure books that I had done in that time frame have come out. These are written, by the way, under the pen name Eric Helm. So, but if you go to Amazon to look them up,
is that a ripoff from Matt Helm?
Yes, exactly. But it was Matt Helm. His code name was Eric, so the pen name was Eric Helm. It's kind of a tribute to Donald. Do
you notice how quickly I picked up on that?
Yes, you're one of the few people that did. Bob Cornett and I are writing a science fiction novel called Remember the Alamo, and we had a character named in it Tom Waters. And the reason I bring this up is I wrote the line, "Waters rushed uphill," and he says, "You can't."
Well, I can remember another character in
Well,
there.
no, he said you can't write.
Jessica Wolf.
Well, he said, Bob said, you can't write that. Nobody's, Waters Rushed Uphill. I said, nobody's ever going to get it because it's a character's name, Waters Rushed Uphill, and they don't associate it to. It was a joke that I wrote for the book. In the Vietnam Ground Zero series, there was a glossary in the back in some of the books, and it says horse, and then it says sea biscuit, SEE biscuit. And then you go to biscuit, and there's a definition there, which I totally made up. But the joke is, horse is sea biscuit. It was a joke. Nobody ever got that either. So we did that sort of thing. But Eric Helm was a pen name that I used. Science fiction, I write under my own name, and I had two of them just come out. One was the Interplanetary Defense Force, which is, I think, really a kind of a neat little book. And one called On the Second Tuesday of Next Week just was published in the last 3 or 4 weeks, which is a time travel story where they end up fighting a battle out near Pluto to defeat the enemy out there. And they come back and they discover that they've lost. And the gag is some of the people were in transit. And so they were kind of protected by this time change. So they knew what really happened. And it becomes a who can get the earliest change made so they can't reverse it. So it's a time travel story. And one of the gags in there is the guy was just on the cusp of inventing time travel. And he says, I need some help. And pretty soon he gets notes from himself in the future on how to complete the time travel story because he was so close he could do it. But it's so I've done a number of science fiction. There's another science fiction story come out. The Interplanetary Defense Force is part of a series, and the second one is coming out, I think, in July. I'm just finishing up a series called Global War, which the publisher in English is going to publish, and it's a 5-book series. So I've been doing an awful lot of that kind of thing, trying to keep up with doing the blog, which I
Are these available? Are these available on Amazon?
Oh, absolutely. You go to Eric Helm, you'll find those. You go to and it cross links to me sometimes. You go to Kevin Randle, you'll find the latest UFO book was called 1973, and it started out. I was interviewing Calvin Parker. And he was talking about how there were additional witnesses to their abduction. And I said, well, they all came out years later. And he said, no, there's some right away. Got me looking at it. There's a document that was written by Air Force officers the day after the Hicks and Parker abduction, where they're interviewing him about the abduction. And in that document, it mentions 4 other witnesses that witnessed the abduction. And so I did a book on that, and it's about 1973 and about the series of sightings that took place and all the abductions. I think it's the latest UFO book, and I'm under contract to do another one that just looks at the tales of alien visitation in a chronological way, how it's evolved and where we are in today's environment. So I've been doing a lot of that, but the action adventure books have kind of taken a lot of time because they're doing very well on Amazon and that sort of thing. So yes, thank you for the opportunity to bring that up. But look for Eric Helm, look for Kevin Randle. You'll find I did a book called it being switched to a publisher. I got a book coming out that Understanding Roswell, which looks at the people who were involved and what happened to them after this event. One of the guys, and I think it was Payne Jennings, who was one of the, he was either the deputy commander at Roswell or the executive officer at Roswell. He was killed in the Korean War. They were testing some big, huge bomb, and they went to drop it, and it detonated in the bomb bay and blew the aircraft all to hell and God. So I've done a lot of that sort of thing, but I've been concentrating on the action adventure stuff because the UFO stuff is being hijacked, probably the wrong word.
Well, I was going to say,
people coming out telling stories that I just simply do not believe.
I was going to say that when I was in college, my major was history, and my love is not only history, but military history. And I actually got 3 battles that are my favorite. And one is King Leonidas at Thermopylae, facing off the Persians. Number 2, Gettysburg, July 1 through 3. in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania during the Civil War. I had family, by the way, that fought there on the Union side. And my last, and I got to say, this is the one that has hooked me up since I was a kid, is the Alamo, the Battle of the Alamo. And I can still to this day remember my father, his father, and I was just a little kid, went to the movies, Walt Disney's Davy Crockett, when I was at the movies. And of course, at the end of the film, there's Crockett swinging old Betsy. You know, the Mexicans are trying to get him and he's trying to club them off. And well, there was something about that story that just hooked me for my entire life. Now, with that being said, you wrote a novel about the Alamo.
Well,
and you sent me a copy.
We did.
You sent me a copy.
We did a book called Remember the Alamo, and the gag was, it's another time travel book. The gag was
right.
They sent a group of mercenaries to the Alamo. They sent 30 mercenaries. And you know the story, there was 32 guys that came from Goliad to reinforce the Alamo around March 1st. Well, those are our characters. The book I was talking about where waters rushed uphill, that's in the Alamo book. And we did a subsequent book called Remember Gettysburg, and then Remember the Little Bighorn, because the Alamo book had done pretty well, so it became part of a series. So we had to investigate Gettysburg, and I was always kind of fascinated by the Little Bighorn as well, because how could you screw that up so badly, George? I can't tell you.
Well, he did. He was an arrogant guy. That's how he did it. His arrogance.
That, yes, among other faults. Well, just before we went to Iraq, I'm the intelligence officer of a battalion going to Iraq, and during one of the staff meetings, it came up about the Little Bighorn, and they were saying, "Well, we hope we get better intelligence than they got at the Little Bighorn." And I said, "He got great intelligence. He was told, you right down in that valley, you're not coming out," and that's exactly what happened. So,
and what did he do? He split his regiment into 3 groups.
No, 4. You forgot the pack train had one company assigned to protect it. So he had 3 battalions, he called them, with one with Reno, one with Benteen, and then he had 5 companies. The 5 companies with him, by the way, were C, E, F, L, and I, and I cannot tell you why I know that. That he rode down into the valley and didn't come out. But we had done those books, so I thank you for bringing them up. Those, of course, are available on Amazon. Did that with Bob Cornett, so we had a good time with those books. While doing those books, well, there's 2 stories that go with that. While doing the Alamo book, I saw the movie The Final Countdown, which is the movie where they were going to send the jet fighters to take out the Japanese force at Pearl Harbor.
Did you read that? Did you read what they just put up there?
Now
we know what's wrong with Don. He had Union ties.
But I saw that movie, and they never mixed it up with the Japanese force. And we were doing Remember the Alamo, and I said, I know exactly what we need to do. So there's a point in the battle where the Mexicans are coming over the South Wall, which they had a rough time for. And our guys had not been using the automatic weapons until that happened. And there was the battle that took place there, and I said, and it was all over in 90 seconds, because I wanted to see that in the book. I was at a science fiction convention just recently, and the guy was going through the guy doing the discussion, the panel discussion, he was talking about The Final Countdown, and I was telling that story, and some guy in the back of the room yelled, "Kevin Randle wrote that story, Remember the Alamo." And the host said, "Well, he's sitting right there. Why don't you ask him about it?" So anyway, for those of you who are interested, there's a whole bunch of Eric Helm books that I'm sure you'll enjoy. They're all available at Amazon.
Is that ERIC, ERIC, or ERIK?
No, ER, just like Eric in the Matt Helm books, which you noticed. Donald Hamilton wrote those books, by the way. But yes, that was why the name was picked, Eric Helm. And we were at a science fiction convention, and there was actually a kid named there, Eric, who was named Eric Helm.
Really?
So yeah, well, I guess it's not that uncommon a name. But
Well,
anyway,
we're gonna be counting down here, Kevin,
I see we have
to the
5 minutes.
end of the show.
Okay.
Well, yeah, that was a couple of minutes ago. So
Oh,
we've got about 2.5, 3 minutes left. Tell me, what do you have besides your writing? Do you have anything else going on? Are you going to be giving a talk or lecture at any event or anything?
I'm going to Roswell, of course. I've been invited there. In October, they're having a festival in Nova Scotia, and I'm the keynote speaker there. But it's October, so it's quite a ways off.
Oh, I was just notified by our producer. I lied. I said we had a couple of minutes left. We don't. We are now officially 3 seconds past due. So, Kevin, I want to thank you so much. This was so enjoyable. We will do it again. Gerry, maybe you'll drink some coffee next time and be alive or something, Just
I have nothing to really add here because all I want to do is ask questions, and it's like, no. There's much more going on here. I'll be quiet.
That's it tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Look, Thursday, UAP Crossfire, beginning at 5 p.m. Pacific time, 8 Eastern. Richard Dolan will be on the show. Okay, that's it, gang. Good night. Have a good one.